Hello again. I thought I'd read you something else. This is Thumbelina by Hans Christian Andersen. I'll read part of it anyway. Once upon a time there was a woman who longed to have a tiny child, but she simply did not know where to find one. So she went to see an old witch and told her, "I long with all my heart to have a little child. Won't you tell me where to find one?" "Oh, we'll soon sort that out," said the witch. "Here is a grain of barley, not the kind that grow in farmer's field or used to feed the hens, but if you put it in a flower pot, you'll soon see what happens." "Thank you very much," said the woman, giving the witch 12 shilling pieces. Home she went and planted the grain of barley, and at once a lovely big flower shot up, which looked just like a tulip, but its petals were tightly closed, as if it was still in bud. "What a wonderful flower," said the woman, kissing the pretty red and yellow petals, but as she kissed them, the flower gave a great snap and opened. It really was a tulip, as she could see now, but in the very heart of the flower, on the green stigma, sat a tiny little girl, delicate and graceful, no taller than the length of your thumb, and so she was called Thumbelina. For a cradle she was given the painted shell of a walnut, with blue-violet petals for her mattress and a rose petal for her quilt. There she slept at night, but day by day she played on the table, on which the woman had placed a dish which she had edged with flowers, their stalks lying in the water. A big tulip leaf floated there, and on that Thumbelina would sit and sail from side to side of the dish, one to the other. She had 2 white horses' hairs to row with. It was a fine sight. She could sing, too, in a voice so rare that no one had heard the like before. One night, when she was lying in her pretty bed, an ugly toad came hopping in at the window, which had a broken pane. The toad was large, wet, and hideous, and it hopped right down on the table where Thumbelina lay asleep on the red rose petal. These drawings are by Sven Ottos. "She would make a lovely wife for my son," said the toad, and picking up the walnut shell in which Thumbelina slept, she hopped off with her through the broken pane and into the garden. The toad lived with her son in the swampy, muddy verge of a broad stream. Her son was as foul and nasty as his mother. "Croak, croak," was all he would say when he saw the pretty little girl in the walnut shell. "Don't talk so loud or you'll wake her," said the old toad. "She could easily run away. She's as light as swan's down. We'll put her in the stream on one of the broad water-lily leaves, and for her, light and little as she is, it will be like an island. She can't run away from there while we get the house ready under the mud for the 2 of you to live in." There were many water-lilies growing in the stream, all of them with these broad green leaves, which look as though they are floating on the water. The leaf that was furthest out was also the biggest of all, and there it was that the old toad left Thumbelina in her walnut shell. The poor tiny creature woke up very early next morning, and when she saw where she was, she began to weep bitterly, for the big green leaf was entirely surrounded by water. There was no way in which she could get back to land. The old toad sat down in the mud, decorating her house with reeds and yellow water flowers. It was to be made really attractive for her new daughter-in-law. And then she swam with her ugly son to the leaf where Thumbelina stood. They had come to fetch her pretty bed, which was to be set up in the bridal chamber before she herself arrived. The old toad bowed deep in the water before her, saying, "Here is my son, who is to be your husband, and you will have a beautiful home down in the mud." "Croak, croak," was all the son would say. Then they took the pretty little bed and swam away with it, while Thumbelina sat all alone on the green leaf, crying, for she did not want to live with the ugly toad or marry her hideous son. The little fish swimming down there in the water must have seen the toad and heard what she said, because they popped their heads up to have a look at the little girl. As soon as they saw her, they thought her so beautiful that it hurt them to think of her living down below with the nasty toad. Now that must never happen. They flocked around the green stalk, holding up the leaf on which Thumbelina stood, and gnawed it through with their teeth, so that the leaf went floating down the stream, carrying Thumbelina away, far away, where the road could not catch her. Where the toad could not catch her. Thumbelina sailed past many strange places, and the little birds in the bushes saw her and sang, "What a beautiful maiden she is." The leaf that bore her floated further and further away until Thumbelina was carried to foreign countries. A sweet white butterfly began to fly round her, and at last alighted on the leaf, for it had fallen in love with Thumbelina, who was happy now, for the toad could not reach her, and it was so delightful sailing along on her leaf. The sun shone on the water like gleaming gold. She took off her sash and tied one end around the butterfly, the other to the leaf, which was travelling much faster now, and so was she, for she was standing on it. All of a sudden, a great big May-bug flew up, caught sight of her on the instant. It had closed its claws around her slender waist and flown into a tree with her, but the green leaf went floating on down the stream, and the butterfly flew with it, because he could not get away. Poor little Thumbelina was terrified when the May-bug flew into the tree with her, but most of all she was distressed about the pretty white butterfly tied to the leaf, who would now starve to death because he could not get away. But none of that mattered to the May-bug, which sat down beside her on the biggest green leaf on the tree, gave her honey from the flowers to eat, and told her how beautiful she was, although she was not in the least like a May-bug. Then all the other May-bugs living in the tree came to visit them. They looked at Thumbelina, and the spinster May-bugs raised their antennae and said, "Well, she's only got two legs. How wretched." "She has no antennae," they said. "Her waist is so skinny. She looks just like a human being. Isn't she ugly?" said all the female May-bugs, although Thumbelina was beautiful. The May-bug who had picked her up thought so too, but when all the others said she was ugly, he began to believe it himself, and he did not want her any more. She could go where she liked. He flew down from the tree with her and set her down on a daisy, where she cried because she was so ugly that the May-bug did not want her, although she was the prettiest creature you could imagine, as delicate and transparent as a rose petal. Throughout the summer, poor Thumbelina lived all alone in the great wood. She plaited a great hammock for herself and hung it under a big dock leaf to shield herself from the rain. She ate the honey from the flowers and drank the morning dew from the petals. So summer and autumn passed, and then came winter, then the long, cold winter. Twice. All the birds who had sung so sweetly for her flew away. Trees and flowers withered. The big dock leaf, which had been her roof, rolled up until it was no more than a faded yellow stalk, and she was terribly cold. For her clothes were worn out, and she herself was so tiny and fragile, poor Thumbelina, that it seemed that she would freeze to death. Soon it began to snow, and every snowflake that fell was the same to her as a shovelful would be to us, because we are big and she was no taller than your thumb. And so she wrapped herself in a withered leaf, but it was no good. She was still shivering with cold. Just outside the wood, where she was now, lay a big cornfield. But the corn had gone long ago, and only the bare dry stubble rose out of the frozen earth. The stubble was like a forest to her, and as she walked through it, she shuddered with cold. Then she came to the field mouse's door, a little hole under the stubble. There the field mouse kept herself warm and comfortable, with a whole roomful of corn, and a nice kitchen and a dining room. Poor Thumbelina stopped just inside the door, like any poor beggar girl, and begged for a little piece of one barley corn, because she had had nothing to eat for 2 days. "You poor little thing," said the field mouse, for she was a good old field mouse at heart. "Come into my warm house and eat with me." Since she had now taken a liking to Thumbelina, she said, "I will gladly have you to stay for the winter, but you must keep my house nice and clean and tell me stories, because that's what I like." And Thumbelina did what the good old field mouse said and led a pleasant life with her. "We're going to have a visitor soon," the field mouse told her. "My neighbour comes to see me once a week. He's even better off than I am, with a big drawing room and a beautiful velvet coat. If you could get him for a husband, you'd be well looked after. But he cannot see. You'd better tell him the very best stories you know." But Thumbelina did not do as she said, because the neighbour was a mole, and she did not want him at all. He came to visit them in his black velvet coat, very rich and learned, as the field mouse said. His home was more than 20 times as big as the field mouse's, and certainly he was learned, but he could not bear the sun, and the pretty flowers couldn't stand the pretty flowers, and spoke ill of them because he had never seen them. Thumbelina had to sing for him, and she sang both "Fly, Maybug, Fly" and "The Monk Wandered in the Meadow," and the mole fell in love with her for the sake of her beautiful voice. But he said nothing because he was a sober-minded man. He had just dug a long corridor for himself, from his house to theirs, where the field mouse and Thumbelina were allowed to walk as often as they liked, but he asked them not to be afraid of the dead bird which was lying in the corridor. It was a whole bird, with feathers and beak, which must have died just before the weather began and was now buried where he had dug his passage. The mole picked up a bit of rotten wood in his mouth, for it shines like fire in the darkness, and walking ahead of them, he lighted their way down the long, dark corridor. When they reached the place where the dead bird lay, the mole made a hole in the roof with his broad nose for the light to shine through. In the middle of the passage lay a dead swallow, its pretty wings pressed to its sides, its legs and head drawn in under its feathers. The poor bird must have died of cold. Thumbelina felt so sorry for it, for she loved all the birds, which had sung and twittered so prettily for her all summer long. But the mole gave it a push with his short legs and said, "That won't be cheeping any more. How miserable it must be to be born a bird. Thank goodness none of my children will be, because a little bird like that has nothing but its twittering, and in winter it must die." "Yes, that is what you would say, being a sensible man," said the field mouse. "What good is all its twittering to a bird when winter comes? It's bound to starve and freeze to death. But it must be a good life, too." Thumbelina said nothing, but when the other two turned their backs on the bird, she stopped and kissed its closed eyes. "Perhaps it was the one that sang to me in summertime," she thought. "What joy it gave me then. Dear, pretty bird." The mole stopped the hole up again, blocking out the light, and took the ladies home. These pictures are quite spooky. But that night, Thumbelina couldn't get to sleep. She left her bed and wove a big blanket of hay, which she carried down and spread over the dead bird, putting soft cotton wool, which she had found in the field mouse's room, down its sides, so that it should be warm on the cold ground. "Goodbye, you pretty little bird," she said. "Goodbye, and thank you for your lovely song in the summer, when all the trees were green and the sun shone down so warmly on us." She laid her head against the bird's breast and started back, but there seemed to be something beating inside the bird's heart. The swallow was not dead, but in a swoon, and now it was warm. It came to life again. In the autumn, all the swallows fly off to the warm countries, but any that are delayed freeze and fall down dead, to lie where they fall until the snow covers them over. Thumbelina shook from head to toe, really frightened now, for to her the bird was very, very big. But she plucked up her courage, tucked the cotton wool more tightly around the poor swallow, and fetched the curled mint leaf which had been her quilt, and laid it over the bird's head. Next day she crept down to it again, and now it was fully conscious, but so weak that it could only open its eyes for a moment to look at Thumbelina standing with a piece of rotten wood in her hand, for she had no other light. "Thank you, you lovely child," said the sick swallow. "You have warmed me so beautifully that I shall soon regain my strength and be able to fly out in the warm sunshine." "Oh," she said, "it's very cold outside, cold and freezing. You stay in your warm bed, and I will take care of you." She brought water to the swallow in a petal, and he drank and told her how he'd had a torn wing on a thorn bush and been unable to fly as fast as the other swallows when they flew away to the warm countries. At last he had fallen to earth, but he could remember no more and had no idea how he had come to this place. The swallow stayed underground all winter, cared for by Thumbelina, who was very fond of him. She told neither the mole nor the field mouse what she was doing, because they did not like the poor swallow at all. As soon as it was spring and the sun began to warm the earth, the swallow said goodbye to Thumbelina, who opened up the hole made by the mole. The sun shone brightly through it, and the swallow asked Thumbelina to come with him. Sitting on his back, she could fly with him far out over the green forest, but Thumbelina knew that it would distress the old field mouse if she deserted her. "No, I can't," said Thumbelina. "Goodbye, goodbye, you good, beautiful girl," said the swallow, and out he flew into the sunshine. Thumbelina watched him, her eyes full of tears, for she was also very fond of the poor swallow. "Tweet, tweet," sang the bird, flying off into the green forest. Thumbelina was very unhappy. She was never allowed to go out into the warm sunshine, and the corn that the farmer had sown over the field mouse's house had grown so high that it was like a dense forest to the poor little girl, who measured only a thumb's length. "Now you must spend the summer making your trousseau," the field mouse told her, for by now the drab mole in his black velvet coat had asked her to marry him. "You must have both woolens and linen, cushions and bedding when you become the mole's wife." Thumbelina had to spin by hand, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders to spin and weave night and day. Every night the mole came to visit them, and all he talked about was that when the summer was over, the sun would not be so hot, for now it baked the earth as hard as a stone. Yes, when the summer was over, he would marry Thumbelina, but this gave her no pleasure, for she did not like the drab mole at all. Every morning at sunrise and every evening at dusk, she would creep out to the doorway, and as the wind parted the ears of corn so that she could see the blue sky, she thought how light and beautiful it was out here, and longed to see the dear swallow again. But the swallow never came. He must have been flying far away among the beautiful green trees. When autumn came, Thumbelina had completed her trousseau. I leave it there. Poor Thumbelina caught in the middle of the story. Hopefully I'll return to it soon. I'll see you again in the next episode.